All right, CompGov students, hello, I am back, and we are moving on with political participation in China. And I am going to be sending you a link to the movie, the documentary that we did not get to watch in class this week because of, wait for it, our pandemic. And it's called Please Vote for Me. And the reason I mention this now is because when you look at these kids, these are youth in China who are wearing the very distinctive red kerchief. That is symbolic of a 17 to 14-year-old Chinese child being part of a group called the Young Pioneers. And this is sort of a Communist Party driven sort of, association that pretty much most young kids in China belong to. And it's part of the indoctrination of communism as part of their political socialization. So the schools are a place that China takes very seriously in terms of monitoring what teachers and students are doing. The Young Pioneers is for the younger kids. The teenagers, the older teenagers from 14 on up, are members of the Communist Youth League. And here you can see them when they're red blazers and their gold kerchiefs. And I would say fewer numbers of kids belong to the Communist Youth League. As they get older, they get to make their own decision whether they want to be a part of such a thing. But again, it's part of their whole socialization. And I bring up the Please Vote for Me because it's this third grade class that does a simulation in democracy. And so the kids kind of look like these kids here. Actually, they're a little bit younger. They're third graders. I'd love it if you'd watch it because I think you'd really, really enjoy the documentary. Is the world going to, implode if you don't? No. But I think you'll really enjoy it while you're bored. I'll be interested to see what you say. I think you'll learn a lot about, Chinese society, and it's just a good laugh. This kid named Chen Cheng, is in his underwear most of the time. I think you'll really like it. So I'm going to send you the link. I hope you'll have a chance between now and when we resume next Monday, the March 30th, to watch that. All right, consumerism. Probably the most widely shared value in China today. I mean, people having gone from the Communist Party owning everything in China to now pretty much a capitalist society. Let's just say the Chinese have not minded that, not one bit. All right, let's move to civil society. It is growing, but it is still very, very limited and always controlled. Key thing to keep in mind about China, all roads lead to the CCP. Now, some interest groups are allowed. You can complain about the environment, for example. You can complain about coronavirus even. You can complain about, a bunch of stuff, AIDS or legal reforms or things of that sort. But they will not let you complain about democracy or lack thereof. They will not let you lobby on behalf of initiating more democracy in society. They will not allow you to criticize the government, for example. So you've got to be very, very careful about what kind of protesting you do in China, and it's got to be very approved, if you will. Non-governmental organizations, you have to register, and they can't be political. So China actually makes you register in the state and nothing political. I mean, it's all about the Communist Party. You're not going to be having any political interest groups or organizations whatsoever. The CCP controls the media. The state media is run by the CCP. All roads lead to the CCP. They're going to let you do some, investigative journalism with regard to human interest stories, the arts, things of that sort, but you are not going to get to delve into the details of what Xi Jinping is like, or how the government is run, or getting, peeling back the onion of transparency. None of that is going to be allowed in China. And just to point out the obvious, the Great Firewall of China has been in place for a long, long time. Since the internet became a thing, China has controlled what people can see. This was a recent article that came out, I think about a year and a half, maybe two at the most, that basically talks about, this was in The Economist, and it talks about, I don't know if this is showing up or not, but it says China's Great Firewall is rising. And actually, under Xi Jinping's leadership, there is no question that that is the case. Before he was jailed, few people had heard of Wu, but when news of his conviction appeared in a state newspaper in late December, internet users across China took note. This guy was helping people get around the firewall. And so for that, he earned a trip to the prisons. So that's a little too bad. But that's kind of what happened to him. So they're going to protect their control over the media, every single day. Now, the truth of the matter is, young, smart Chinese are able to figure out how to get around it, just like this guy who was arrested was. But for all intents and purposes, they've got people working for the government who are working really hard to keep that firewall intact. All right, religion. Well, what about religion? Well, it's officially an atheist state. If you were in a world history class, you would know that there are no gods in China. They don't practice or endorse one religion over another. They are, as a state, atheist. If you choose to practice a religion, that's up to you. Actually, the Constitution in 2007 passed a freedom of religion clause. However, let's be clear that all religions are closely monitored by the CCP. The Chinese Catholic Church cannot recognize the authority of the Pope, and at any time that the Catholic Church might refer to the Pope for any reason, that church is likely to be shut down. So Christians can practice their religion as long as it doesn't come into conflict with the state. Buddhists, Muslims, to a lot lesser extent these days, but they will allow you to practice your religion to some extent. Now, Muslims have come under great control of recent date. We'll talk about that briefly when we get to the Uyghurs. But it's officially an atheist state. All right, social movements and protests. We already talked about Tiananmen Square, and this, of course, was a big sort of pro-democracy movement that was squelched by Deng Xiaoping in 1989. This movement came and it went. 1990s, a new movement started called Falun Gong. And I don't know if you've ever heard of Falun Gong. It's become pretty popular in New York City. It's a spiritual movement. It's like a little bit of Buddhism, a little bit of Taoism, and then a little bit of yoga, all sort of mixed together. And it became super popular in the 1990s in China, and they would be leading sort of, big sort of mass gatherings in Tiananmen Square and other major squares in the major cities. And it was like yoga movements, and they did all these chants and things. And the party, the CCP, got very, very nervous about it. They deemed it to be an evil cult. They didn't understand it. They didn't like what they didn't understand, and they closed it down. And people were really frustrated by this. And they're like, are you kidding me? This is just like a move. This is just like Falun Gong is like a movement, in that it's mostly yoga and things that had already been permitted. But because it became so cultish and so many people were sort of wanting to join in on it, they started to get nervous because they thought people would be following the Falun Gong leaders instead of themselves. So this is what happens in China. If anything starts to threaten their ability to control, their ability to get people to do what they want them to, they'll shut it down. It's crackdown all day long. All right, labor unrest, especially in the outlying rural areas. You've got people who are, anxious on the countryside for a lot of reasons. There's a lot less interaction with people, so sometimes you get like these little power-hungry mayor types who sort of threaten people out in the country. You've also got some labor unrest in the cities as well when they are, realizing that they don't have as much as so many others. But again, it's all very, very much kept under control. Grassroots protests in the countryside are your biggest source of unrest because of what I just mentioned. Sometimes people taking advantage of the fact that they are in remote locations and, regular city party members aren't paying attention to what's going on. All right, let's look at coinciding cleavages. Number one cleavage in China, bar none, is the urban versus rural cleavage. And so if you look at my little map here, you can see, all the political power and the development is happening on the eastern seaboard. You add the wealth is happening on the eastern seaboard in the cities, and all of the, industrial and manufacturing companies and finance now and technology. It's all happening on the eastern seaboard. The best education is happening on the eastern seaboard. So you look at all of these cleavages between the urban areas, which seem to have just about everything, and then you go out to the west where Tibet is, or Xinjiang, or some of these outlying areas, and they don't have so much of this. They don't have political power. They don't have educational opportunities. Their jobs aren't as good. They don't have the wealth. It's definitely an us versus them. But it's not that dangerous because the CCP keeps such a tight rein on it. All right, number two cleavage, 100% ethnicity. Non-Chinese citizens make up a significant part of the population. However, they are really not given the same kind of advantages as the Han Chinese in the more populous areas. So let's get some facts out here. Han Chinese make up about 92% of the population, and they pretty much comprise the ethnic majority. Ethnic minorities, on the other hand, are living mostly in your 5 autonomous regions. If you go over here to the map, you've got Inner Mongolia, you've got Xinjiang, you've got Tibet, you've got Guangxi, and so forth. These 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 regions make up the 5 autonomous regions. The only 2 that I really care that you know about are Xinjiang and Tibet. Now, most of these outlying areas, and it's not surprising that they kind of make up the borders around the bulk of the population, and in many respects, they create kind of a buffer, to protect everybody else. But what's interesting is that all of this gold area here comprises about 60% of the geographic land. So China is not remotely interested in giving up these autonomous regions, even though most of the people there would just as soon run themselves. Now, the constitution in China will grant some self-government, mostly over cultural affairs, but I would say of recent date, the CCP has taken a lot more control back. This has never been more true than in Xinjiang, and almost as much in Tibet, although it's relaxed a tiny bit more in Tibet these days, because they do not pose quite the same threat that Xinjiang does. And I think this is just unbelievable and fascinating what has happened in Xinjiang, and we'll get to that more so in the next screencast, where I've got just a really good video on the situation. But let's get kind of the basic facts out here about Tibet and Xinjiang. All right, so Tibet. Tibet has always wanted its independence. There have been times when it has been independent, and more times when it's been under Chinese control. They were conquered once and for all by the PRC, the People's Republic of China, in the 1950s after Mao established control in 1949. Tibetans, to this day, want independence. Maybe you're familiar with some Free Tibet movements. We've had groups here at the school that have been all about Free Tibet. And they've had people, depending on how many Tibetans we have, they have, had people bringing awareness to their cause. Now, the Dalai Lama has always been the spiritual leader. He had to flee to India in 1959 when Mao's army finally took over all of Tibet. And there was an uprising after Mao took over in the earlier 1950s. Tibetans tried to rise up against the Chinese, and that was a mistake because they were no match for the Chinese military. So the Dalai Lama fled, I believe, to Nepal initially, and then has been gone ever since. Now, one of the things that the Chinese have done, or the Tibetans rather, have done to bring awareness to their cause is self-immolations. And this has created a huge problem for China. And I don't know if you're familiar with self-immolations or not, but this is when you set yourself on fire. And it's quite dramatic, and it gets people's attention. And that's what Tibetans have tried to do, to say, hey, we don't like what's going on here. We want our independence, and we want you to help us. Well, the government, whenever these self-immolations happen, they immediately crack down, and then they kind of converge on Tibet and try to up the assimilation strategies. So they don't like this. It looks very oppositional. They don't like the kind of attention that it brings to China. And so they crack down militarily, which is always their response, and they quickly try to maintain control. When we return, I will show you the short video that goes into some detail about the self-immolations.